It is so good to be back in Middle-earth. Welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally. Today, I'm talking about the roots of fantasy, the ore fantasy, so to speak. This is a vlog of the first book of The Lord of the Rings. Just to clarify, Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings to be one book, and he divided it inside that one book into 6 books. How many times can I say book in one sentence? Book, 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 book. I am vlogging his division of the books, so one book per video. That does not mean The Fellowship of the Ring in one video. The Fellowship of the Ring is 2 books. After I finish 2 books, there will be a chat. So after The Fellowship of the Ring, which is 2 books, after Two Towers, which is 2 books, and after Return of the King, there'll be a chat with Mike and Philip and AP Canavan and myself. But first, a short story. Years ago, I went to visit a very, very good friend of mine. And when he opened the door, he had on a hoodie, a very particular hoodie. And the first thing I said to him is, "Oh my God, that's the White Tree of Gondor." And we realized that we are both Lord of the Rings fans, which I hadn't known of him before. The next day, when I got up, he handed me this folded up hoodie and said it was mine. For me, reading The Lord of the Rings is a little bit like this hoodie. It's old. It's maybe a little ratty. It's got stains that won't wash out, but it's really cozy and it's comfortable and it feels really nice, partially because of the emotional value that is attached to it. Lord of the Rings is a lot like that for me. I've read it, I don't know how many times. It's the first adult book I can remember reading when I was 9 years old. It's so enjoyable to get back into Middle-earth. A couple of disclaimers and warnings before we get started. This is a long video. I basically, at the end of each chapter while I was reading, I recorded something on my phone, just my thoughts. I was kind of generally concentrating on maybe differences between the movies and the books, because I know a lot of younger people who have seen the movies a million times, but never read the books. I think it's good to kind of draw attention to places that maybe the movie did something actually better than the books, but the movies are better, bro. Nah, bro, the only true Tolkien is the books. I am not a movie bro, and I am not a book bro. I love both of them. I think they're both actually pretty awesome. So I'm not getting into discussions like that, and I'd be super happy if there were no discussions like that in the comments. Do what you want, but they're just a waste of time. Also, many Tolkien fans are the most nerdy fans of any fans that ever fanned. I would like to invite you to, well, actually me. There are probably things I got wrong. I'm not the hugest Tolkien expert in the world. There are things I certainly don't know, and there are things that, because of my crap memory, I have no doubt forgotten. So please, write me a well actually comment. And last but not least, I am assuming, since it has pretty much transcended into the overall fantasy consciousness of our world, I'm assuming that you've seen the movies and maybe read the books, or at least read the books if you haven't seen the movies. So this will be spoiler filled, of course, because I'm going through chapter by chapter and talking about what I think and what happened in the chapter. So if you've never read it before and you've never seen the movies, you could watch this chapter by chapter as you're reading. There are chapter markers, so you can skip, and I hope you enjoy watching this as much as I am enjoying reading. Let's get on with it. So I haven't even started yet. I've already got my Lord of the Rings bookmark, and I'm so excited to get into Middle-earth. I'm kind of rushing the end of this book so that I can start Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring tomorrow. So I started with Fellowship of the Ring tonight. And it's been many years since I reread it. And I had completely forgotten that it begins with a prologue, which is not actually a story, but a scholarly essay about hobbits their smoking habits and how they govern themselves in the Shire, and including footnotes and references to appendices and all of that. You can really feel that Tolkien is a professor. It's also interesting because the prologue is obviously written sort of as him, or at least a scholar, writing about this other place, Middle-earth. And I always think of like in-world and out-of-world. So in-world is inside the secondary world of the book. This is really clearly an out-of-world scholar writing about in-world stuff, which is weird. And he doesn't put in any kind of mechanism that would explain that, like Gene Wolfe does in Book of the New Sun. Book of the New Sun, Gene Wolfe says he got this from somewhere, and he's translating it as Gene Wolfe. And he's giving us the translation. Tolkien just writes a scholarly essay about Middle-earth, specifically about hobbits in the Shire, and there's no kind of excuse for how that could be happening. So maybe he's just writing it as the author of the story. I don't know. It's never, or at least so far, not made clear. Anyway, on with the Fellowship. Yeah, the other thing I didn't really remember, he basically spoils the fate of a number of characters already in his scholarly prologue. He makes it clear that at the end of the entire Lord of the Rings, Merry, Pippin, I think he also mentioned Frodo and Bilbo and Gandalf, that they're all alive. Totally weird by today's standards, but I guess maybe not back then. So the first chapter is mostly Bilbo's 11th birthday. We get a really good view of how idyllic the Shire is. Yeah, he's obviously setting up a lot of things which are what could be lost if everything goes really horrible in the rest of the books. We get small town vibes, we get some very nice people, we get some very petty people, but it's also clear that like nobody in the Shire has serious problems. There are no serious dangers. People are comfortable, people are eating good food, having fun at a big birthday party, and then Bilbo disappears. We also get our first glimpse of the ring being a big deal, right? And it's hinted, I like the way that Tolkien builds this up very slowly and subtly. We don't get a huge dump at this point of info or any kind of exposition. We just see that Bilbo will not give up the ring, that he's extremely hesitant to give up the ring and gets quite angry when it's pointed out to him a couple of times by Gandalf that he should give up the ring, leave it for Frodo, and go. But it's also, I mean, especially once you really understand later in the books what a serious threat the ring is and how much the ring can control a person and what it did to Gollum over many years. It's pretty amazing and a testament to Bilbo that he gives it up and then cheerfully walks out the door without it, which is not something many people can do with the ring. But yeah, the first chapter is mostly Shire atmosphere, but it also sort of starts bringing in the threat of the ring. We don't know what the bigger threat around the world is yet. We'll get that in chapter 2, but it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting character builder for Gandalf and also for Bilbo. It's an ugly, wet day, so it's a perfect bathrobe reading Sunday morning. I noticed in the chapters I've read so far, I'm into chapter 2, stuff that was completely taken out for the movie. And rightly so. I'm not a book purist by any means. I totally understand the needs to make a movie that is not boring. And some of these scenes, like there's the scene where Bilbo disappears, or after Bilbo disappears, and he's giving away gifts, and basically all of the hobbits come and raid his house and are looking for buried treasure in his walls and that kind of thing. It adds a lot of character. It gives you a bit of a feeling, more of a feeling of the Shire and what the people there are like, but it's not necessary. I didn't miss it in the movies. Also interesting, somehow I didn't have it in mind that it was 20 years between Bilbo disappearing and Frodo leaving the Shire. It makes me wonder, like when Gandalf comes back and is explaining everything about the ring, he's had 20 years to figure it out. He's had 20 years to research it, and he's had 20 years in which he could have come back and thrown the ring in the fire and determined, yes, this is actually that ring. And he was off chilling somewhere else, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, it's going well so far. I'm so happy to be back in Middle-earth. Also, a sign that I have changed since first reading these. I'm really, really conscious already in chapter 2 that, you know, Frodo and Sam are not friends. Frodo and Sam are master and servant. Frodo is essentially Hobbiton nobility. Bilbo was always considered eccentric, but he was also basically the richest guy in town. And Frodo's his heir, which is also a very typical sort of nobility, monarchy kind of thought. And he's paying Sam to do his garden. Sam's just his gardener. Of course, they become friends. We all know that. Yeah, Sam calls him Master Baggins. Frodo calls Sam Sam, which is the whole class thinking. I don't really have it at all. And I know it's a real thing in England, though. It's very different. Like if you're an American or American and an Australian like me, you don't really have these kinds of concepts. There's rich people and poor people, sure, but class doesn't really exist in that sense. Whereas it's a very clearly defined, stratified thing in England. And especially like in Tolkien's time, it was much more still a thing. And yeah, Frodo and Sam are not in the same class, and they are not friends. It's all set up later in the book, this dichotomy between Gollum and Smeagol, and Gollum, of course, is the bad side, and Smeagol is the good side. But it's interesting, the first description we get of Smeagol from Gandalf in chapter 2, he was interested in roots and beginnings. He dived into deep pools. He burrowed under trees and growing plants. He tunneled into green mounds, and he ceased to look at the hilltops or the leaves on trees or the flowers opening in the air. His head and his eyes were downward. So he's already way back before he found the ring. He was already kind of a questionable, maybe a bit dodgy guy.
At this rate, this vlog is going to be really long, but chapter 2 is dropping all sorts of really, really relevant stuff. Let me read a bit, which is Frodo's motivation for the entire Lord of the Rings. I should like to save the Shire if I could, though there have been times when I thought the inhabitants too stupid and dull for words and have felt that an earthquake or an invasion of dragons might be good for them. But I don't feel like that now. I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I shall know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet cannot stand there again. Frodo, as soon as he gets the story of the ring from Gandalf, he's already got a clear idea of what he's going to be doing for the rest of the book. Amazing little hobbit. And another thing, Gandalf is described as having eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. Think about that for a minute. Beyond the brim of his hat, and he's got this wide-brimmed, wizardy hat. I'm just going to file that one in the same box as Acrobat Tyrion and move on.
So, speaking of Gollum being kind of scary, I never picked up on this before, but when Gandalf is explaining to Frodo all of what's been going on, and that everything he's found out about the ring, about Gollum, and that sort of stuff, there is a mention of Gollum stealing babies from their cribs. So, keep in mind, Gollum is a baby murderer. I think in the movies, Gollum is presented as kind of a cute sidekick in a way. For this reread, I am going to be keeping in mind that he is a walking fucking nightmare. So our three hobbits persevere, and they run into some elves. And Frodo says to them, I would welcome your company. And they reply, but we have no need of other company, and hobbits are so dull, they laughed. Elves are dicks. Something I've heard a lot of people say, and when I say people, I mean usually I think younger readers, people who have not read the books. A lot of people seem to be worried about the prose, like the difficulty of reading the text. I can first of all say three things. One, that sounds like people who've only ever tried to read the prologue and stopped there, because the prologue is kind of written like a scholarly essay. It's not written like a story. Yeah, the story starts after the prologue. Skip the prologue. Come back to it later when you're interested to get some detailed information about hobbits. Secondly, the normal writing of the story is super straightforward. Yeah, it's well written, but it's not super flowery. It's not super old school or out of date style or anything like that. It's very straightforward. There are a lot of descriptions of landscape. That was something Tolkien was obviously very into, but the way it's written, the actual prose style, is not at all challenging. It's very straightforward and not that different from anything that I've read that was more modern. The other thing that people talk about when they talk about the text is all of the poems and songs. They are very different. Yeah, that is not something that's included in a lot of modern fantasy. But the best way to do it, in my opinion, is to, first of all, put aside your cynicism and your modern jaded world weariness and take the smirk off your face and just imagine you're living in the extremely simple time that, for example, the hobbits in the Shire are living in. Everything was a bit more face value, and people weren't always looking for hidden meanings or assuming the worst or that kind of thing. And they overall have a much more cheerful approach to things. The other thing I would say about the poetry, thinking back to a time when I was much more actively into poetry, whenever you hit a poem or a song in Lord of the Rings, read it out loud. You may feel stupid, but read it out loud. Poetry is not a thing that's meant to be written. I mean, obviously poetry is meant to be written. What I mean is, it's written so that you can record it, so that you can speak it. Right? Poetry really lives and starts to make sense, really, when you hear it, not when you see it. So I strongly recommend that whenever you hit a poem or a song in Lord of the Rings, stop, find a place where you won't be embarrassed, and actually vocalize the words to yourself. Speak it out loud, because the rhythm and the music of it really doesn't become apparent until you're actually hearing it. So I'll give you an example. The hobbits, the three hobbits, Frodo and Sam and Pippin, are on their way through the Shire to Frodo's new house, and they sing together, which is also kind of unimaginable to us. Like if you were on a hike, you probably wouldn't be singing a song together with your friends that you were hiking with. But we're cynics. Our standard view of the world these days is far more cynical than in Tolkien's time, and much more cynical than the hobbits in the Shire. So they're singing a walking song together, and I'll give you the first stanza. I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. I'm just going to read it. Upon the hearth, the fire is red. Beneath the roof there is a bed, but not yet weary are our feet. Still round the corner we may meet a sudden tree or standing stone that none have seen, but we alone. I love it. I find these poems and songs charming and joyful, and to really enjoy them, though, you do have to drop the smirk, put aside the cynicism, but I think it's worth it. An interesting book-movie difference that I just bumped into. In Chapter 3, the hobbits, Frodo, Pippin, and Sam, they have their first encounter with evil, really, ever. One of the Black Riders is following them. They hear it coming and they get off the road. In the books, or in the book, that scene is pretty straightforward. Frodo has a weird feeling. Frodo is tempted to put on the ring. He feels a little uncomfortable, and the rider scares him a bit. The other two are just hiding so that they won't be seen. No big deal. The rider comes up level to where they're hiding, sniffs, and rides on. That's it. In the movie, I remember that scene being a really spooky, creepy kind of thing, where they were really playing up the otherworldly nature of the rider and the effect that it had on all of the hobbits. Like, you could see clearly that all of the hobbits were terrified for their lives, and that wasn't the case in that scene in the book. I think it's just an emphasis thing. Like, in the movies, it makes much more sense to emphasize how threatening and scary and spooky the riders are at this point. In the book, we're still in the everything is kind of okay phase, right? The Shire is idyllic, it's innocent, there isn't anything to fear, there never has been, or at least longer than anyone can remember, there hasn't been any kind of real threat in the Shire. And the hobbits are naive. They're basically children going out into the world without adults. And that is kind of, I think, what Tolkien is emphasizing in the text. In the movie, of course, that would have been a little more boring than, oh my God, really, really spooky Black Rider. What the fox? Did you catch that with the fox? You've got a character, almost a character. Thinking in human words and things, observing the hobbits. It's the only time it happens in the entire book. I put this in the same box as Gandalf's eyebrows and Acrobat Tyrion. Just what the fox. What does the fox say? Farmer Maggot is my hero. I just love the idea, I love the picture in my head of this short, grumpy old hobbit telling a Nazgul, a Black Rider, up on a horse, who's got to be like 6 times taller than him, telling him in no uncertain terms to go fuck himself. Go, Farmer Maggot. A friend who's a movie fan, who had never read the books, was reading them for the first time, and I remember them saying to me in the early stages of the read, it really takes a long time for them to get out of the Shire, doesn't it? And I never really thought about it, but I'm on page 130, and they're still in the Shire. They're on the Brandywine River, but they're in Bucktown, but they're still in the Shire. They're in Crick Hollow. And of course that was all sped up in the movie. You don't need that. There isn't that much that happens, but I actually really enjoy all of the world building, the coziness in a way, but also you start to see, especially once the Black Riders turn up, you start to see how tough and resilient and brave the hobbits are. We've already had Farmer Maggot tell a Black Rider to go to hell. Go, Farmer Maggot. The Gaffer also told him to piss off. And all of the hobbits are sort of banding together to make sure that they're protecting Frodo and getting him where he needs to be. And it's actually a lot of really nice world building. I really enjoy it. But yeah, it takes a damn long time to get out of the Shire. So finally, Fitz photobomb. Finally, the hobbits get out of the Shire. I think we can officially consider the Old Forest as outside the Shire. It's interesting because the border of the Shire seems to be the border of the comfortable, relaxed, idyllic, good world. And as soon as they go out, everything gets kind of weird. The trees are strange and nature is not their friend anymore. So it's an untamed land that they've crossed the border into. I won't say too much about that. Obviously, there's nature is aware and not very happy with civilization. So it seems like he's setting up a bit of a war between nature and man or hobbits or civilized developments. And the other thing I'll say is
Willow trees are also dicks, apparently. Yeah, Old Man Willow swallows up Merry and Pippin. Frodo falls asleep and the tree tries to drown him. And it's interesting. It's interesting that Sam is the only one that can keep himself together. Sam is still, and this still kind of irritates me, Sam still calls everyone master and sir, and everyone still kind of orders Sam around, even though he's been involved in the conspiracy to make sure that Frodo doesn't leave on his own. It still seems like everyone's treating Sam a bit like he's just a servant. Like Pippin earlier, like a day or two ago in the story, wakes up in the morning and screams at Sam to get breakfast ready. That's partially because Pippin's just kind of a dick. But yeah, they're still treating Sam like he's not just one of the guys, one of their friends. And maybe, I don't know if there's any kind of a statement being made about like Sam keeps his shit together because he's working class and all the rest of them are romantic, scholarly, poetic, I don't know, nobility, and they fall under the spell of Old Man Willow immediately. It's interesting that Sam's the only one that keeps it together. And finally, we get to meet the most important character in the whole book, Tom.
What to say about Tom Bombadil? I know he's a controversial character. A lot of people hate him. Some people love him. I think I love him. I think that's where I'm at on Tom Bombadil. I also realized in reading this, I have so much to say about Tom Bombadil, so many thoughts, that I will do a character video just on him. And I won't say very much in this vlog, otherwise it would end up being an hour long. I will only say, I highly recommend that when you get to the Willow swallowing Merry and Pippin, that you consciously take a moment to drop your modern cynicism and just read it with wonder. Read it as if you were a child, if you can, because I think that's the way to enjoy Tom Bombadil. More than that, I won't say. I am interested. The hobbits sleep at Tom Bombadil's house. And Frodo has a dream, and we know, if we've seen the movies or read the books already, we know that this dream is him basically seeing what is happening with Gandalf right now. Gandalf escaping with the help of the Deus Ex Eagle from Saruman's trap. And I kind of wonder, is Frodo somehow someone who can have visions? Is Gandalf sending him a vision? Or is this somehow enabled by Tom Bombadil and Goldberry and their house and all of the wonderful weirdness that's going on there? I don't know. Just an open question, something I was thinking about. Otherwise, really try and enjoy Tom Bombadil. He's a mix of very deep, interesting lore and total silliness. And I think it's the silliness that a lot of people are not so fond of. But if you ignore the little bits of dancing and singing and stuff like that, he says some really, really interesting things about the world of Middle-earth, about the history of Middle-earth. He even seems to think that Farmer Maggot is a big deal.
Farmer Maggot is my hero. Go, Farmer Maggot.
About the importance of man and hobbits' pursuits in comparison to the importance of nature. Like I said, I need to do a video just about Tom.
These hobbits, they're children out in the world without adults for the first time. Before they even got to Tom, Merry knew that the Barrow-downs were bad news. And then Tom warned them numerous times. So we've had foreshadowing out the ass. And what's the first thing they do when they leave Tom? Get into trouble in a barrow.
This chapter, Fog on the Barrow-downs, is going to be new to anyone who's only seen the movies because it wasn't in them, which is kind of a pity. I understand due to length and flow and everything, you have to do different things in movies. But there's some really interesting things in this chapter. First of all, we get our first introduction to undead in Middle-earth. And that actually becomes really, really relevant much later. The hobbits get saved by a Deus Ex Bombadil, and they get from him stuff he found in the barrow. And that is where they get their swords from. They have really special swords, which in the movie, Aragorn just randomly happens to have 4 hobbit-sized swords in his pocket, and he dumps them when they get to Weathertop. In the book, these are ancient swords made by the men of Westernesse, and they're not magic, or at least they don't seem to be magic, but they're made of a very special metal. It's never really explained in detail, but they have some pretty hot shit swords, which especially later at Weathertop becomes relevant because the Nazgul, the Black Riders, are actually clearly afraid of the hobbits' swords, which makes the hobbits not quite the short losers that they seem to be in the movie on Weathertop.
It's also a really excellent example of how Tolkien is connecting his characters, who are pretty ignorant of the world outside the Shire, connecting them to the really, really deep, rich, old history of Middle-earth.
And lastly, also important and interesting, there is some really, really clear foreshadowing by Tom Bombadil himself, but also by the vision that he gives them, some very clear foreshadowing of Aragorn Strider, who will appear shortly.
They're almost in Bree, and Frodo says, "It may be all we could wish, but it is outside the Shire all the same. Don't make yourselves too much at home," foreshadowing the fact that they will immediately do the opposite.
Side note, who knew that Tolkien was a fat shamer? He has 2 characters named Fatty. One of them is the loser hobbit, Fredegar Bolger, who decides to stay in the Shire because he's afraid. The other one is a pony. Finally, our pile of bumbling idiots has made it to the prancing pony. Damn your almost non-existent brain, Barlaam Butterbur. It's interesting, a scene from this chapter has become one of the most iconic scenes from the movie, but it happened very differently. Frodo puts the ring on in his pocket. The ring doesn't fly out in the air and him looking up and it falls on his finger, but that was actually a really, really cool shot in the movie. Strider is built up to be a sort of spooky, ominous, dodgy dude, which is actually really cool. I remember when I first read the book, I imagined Strider being a lot darker and maybe bigger than Viggo Mortensen is. He had a real threatening, dangerous presence, at least in this chapter. I mean, obviously we find out pretty soon who he is and that he's basically a good guy, but I had this impression for a very long time in the books when I read them many years ago, that Aragorn was maybe not to be trusted, that he was actually a pretty questionable dude. And the visual idea of him, that he was quite ratty looking and dirty and dark and all of that. The hobbits, as I've said before, are children out in the world without adults, and it's nowhere more obvious than at the Prancing Pony. They're telling stories they shouldn't be telling. Their cover story's not thought out very well, and Frodo screws up with the ring. They obviously don't realize the kind of danger they're in. Frodo kind of gets it. Nobody else gets it at all. They haven't really understood yet what's at stake, that this is a world-threatening evil that is chasing them, and that Frodo, because he's the ring bearer, may be the only person that can do anything about it in the entire world. They just don't get any of that yet. They're off for an adventure and having a picnic occasionally and that kind of thing. And it's charming and cute, and they're idiots. I really like the atmosphere that Tolkien built up here as well. It's basically something that should be just like pure good, pure positive. They've been traveling for a while. They're out in the wilds. It's dark, all of that. They find a town. They get to go to a pub. They get to have some beer and some good food and all of that. It should be just purely good. But Tolkien did a really good job of like inserting in various places things to be maybe a little worried about. There are a lot of suspicious characters like the gatekeeper and Nob with his sly grin and wink. And there are some dodgy dudes in the common room at the tavern. It's unfortunately got to be said. Tolkien partook of the default racism of his time. I've never heard anything to make me think he was a racist in the active, aggressive way that H.P. Lovecraft was, but we get our first taste of kind of low-level default racism of the 1930s and 40s in this chapter. The most dodgy, the most threatening person in the room is described very little other than to say that he is swarthy. Swarthy means dark-skinned. So he's using dark-skinned as a shorthand way of saying bad person, untrustworthy person, a threat, scary. Most places it's not mentioned at all, but when we get towards the end, the only army of men who join the evil side are black people. Yeah. It was the time he was writing in, by which I mean in no way to excuse it. However, in the time he was writing, 1930s, 40s, around then, only vaguely mentioning it and not banging on about it was actually pretty progressive for a white guy in Tolkien's position in England at the time. I don't think there are many authors from that time who would have been making active, positive statements about darker-skinned people. Sad but true. It's got a real feeling of, even though all of this is good and it should be just a purely enjoyable atmosphere, there is a real feeling of something questionable going on and there being a threat, though it's not clear yet what it is. So, all 4 hobbits, actually, it's only 3 hobbits, since Merry is still outside and we don't know what's going on with him, went back to the room, a room with a door, and they opened the door and went into their room and closed the door behind them. And they didn't notice a big person, a man, twice their size, had followed them into the room. I don't quite buy it, Professor. Still, I'm glad there is finally an adult in the room. These idiot hobbits may not die in the next couple of chapters. So it finally comes out who Strider really is. I keep imagining reading this for the first time, and you haven't seen the movies, you don't know the story. Gandalf's letter is really weird, especially since he includes a poem in it, which is very cryptic if you don't know who Strider really is and where all of this is going. I love this poem. I think it's super charming, and it gives me goosebumps, because it's got such powerful ideas in it when you know where everything is going. So I'm going to read it for you. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. Isn't that cool? Also, speaking of goosebumps, when Strider finally really reveals himself and we put together the connection between what Gandalf said in the letter and Strider himself, we get this. But I am the real Strider, fortunately, he said, looking down at them with his face softened by a sudden smile. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if by life or death I can save you, I will. I love that. One of the very sensible changes that the movie made in the book, Aragorn, the ranger who's been wandering around for 100 years or more and dealing with all sorts of danger, he's carrying around Narsil. Narsil is a broken sword, and he's got it sheathed at his side. And in the books, there's no mention of him having any other weapon. So right now, at the Prancing Pony, our bumbling idiot children, the hobbits, are better armed than the future king of Gondor, who is a ranger and apparently is adept at dealing with danger. He's carrying around a broken sword. The movie putting this sword in a place of honor in Rivendell, its pieces, before it gets reforged, totally made sense. It's actually one of the stupidest things in the book. The other thing that's kind of stupid, the entire fate of Middle-earth. is hanging upon how busy the prancing pony is and how good a memory, not very good by the way, the innkeeper has. Again, damn your brain, Butterbur. It makes you wonder if maybe Gandalf isn't as smart as everyone says he is. So the Black Riders are here in Bree, and they almost got merry. Tolkien, you're such a professor, including footnotes in the text of a story. Nobody would do that today. And it clears up that what I mentioned, I think, in the prologue. Obviously, he is putting himself not in the story, but into the text as the author of the text, not any kind of Gene Wolfe mechanism that puts him in the world of the story in any way. Awake! Fear! Fire! Foes! Awake! In case you were worried about Fatty Bolger, I was worried about Fatty Bolger, an unfit, cowardly hobbit left alone in a house where we know the Black Riders are going to go there. I was assuming Fatty Bolger was just going to get murderified by them. But he's okay, don't worry. And Buckland is on alert. The horns are blowing that haven't blown in 100 years, and the Black Riders fled. Interestingly, when we get back to Bree and our Hobbit adventurers, Frodo's having another dream. And he's basically dreaming what is happening in Buckland right now, which is interesting. Again, is this something that is normal for him? Is this something that's a power that the ring is giving him? Don't know. Another perfect addition to the movie that wasn't in the books. When the Black Riders do get into the Prancing Pony and they go to the Hobbits' rooms to attack them, which have been set up with dummies in the bed. In the book, we don't see it. We just see the results the next morning. In the movie, it was one of the more spooky, terrifying scenes, and it was awesome that it was in there. In the aftermath of the Black Riders' attack, I find it totally sweet that Tolkien takes a moment to tell us about Merry's ponies. We know from Tom Bombadil that their names are Sharp-Ears, Wise-Nose, Swishtail, Bumpkin, and White Socks, and that they are okay. They find their way back to Fatty Lumpkin, Tom Bombadil's pony, and have a nice time there. And they save themselves a very dangerous journey, but they never get to go to Rivendell. Poor ponies. Last chapter for this vlog. It's a big chapter, like the last one. A lot happens. About 2 weeks of time passes. There's a fair bit of traveling. But interesting, right at the beginning, Strider, Aragorn, says that no weapon can survive touching the Black Riders. And Frodo's sword survived, which is interesting. It's, like I said already, it's a special sword. Also interesting, if you don't know the lore, the larger lore, the legendarium, it's called, of Tolkien and Middle-earth, then you wouldn't know what Elbereth Gathoniel means. Yeah, Frodo yells it right before he stabs, or right after he stabs the Black Rider. And Strider says that that is probably what scared them or drove them away more than him actually stabbing them with his fancy Western-esque sword. Elbereth Gathoniel is actually basically a god, one of the Valar. In the mythological history of Middle-earth, or the cosmology of Middle-earth, there is a god. There is Iluvatar, who created everything. But there's also then the Valar, who are like a mixture of a bunch of different gods. Elbereth is Valar. Most of this chapter is traveling, to be honest. It's a very Tolkien thing, though, that the landscape is a character, in a way. And as they're going through the landscape, we see a lot of the history, the evidence of the history of Middle-earth. In the landscape, we see that a lot of the challenges that the landscape presents are actually because of the history, because the landscape has been changed by men in the distant past. And there are gullies and cliffs and all sorts of things that have to do with old buildings that are mostly gone. But yeah, a lot of this chapter is building up the landscape as challenge that is a lot of the Lord of the Rings. and also starting to build up a lot of the perseverance theme. Throughout the books, there is a lot of wearing down of our heroes, and that they have to keep persevering, they have to keep struggling to not lose hope. And hope is a big theme throughout the entire series. Towards the end of this chapter, movie fans who have not read the books may be surprised. Arwen is not in there at all. So when they're starting to get close to the river that is sort of the border to Rivendell, they encounter an elf named Glorfindel. Again, if you don't really know the lore, if you haven't delved into the Legendarium any, it just seems like some elf. I mean, he's pretty impressive, but he's like some elf. Glorfindel is the baddest of badass elves. He is the baddest ass elf in all of Middle-earth. He's legendary. He's been around for a very long time. He killed a Balrog a long time ago. He's a big deal. He puts Frodo on his horse. His horse is also legendary, Asphalos. And when they get to the ford, where they need to cross the water, Frodo is being called back by the Black Riders. And I guess they have this influence on him partially because he's been stabbed and he's still got a piece of that knife in him, but also just because he's the ring bearer. He has the ring. And this is actually maybe the first place where we really get to see that Frodo is kind of a badass. He actually draws his sword and more or less tells them to go to hell, calls on Elbereth and Luthien for support, and is trying to fight the influence of Black Riders. He doesn't really manage, but he crosses the ford alone. There is no Arwen. He's not riding on anyone else's horse with them. That famous scene where Arwen says, "Come and get him," I think. Yeah, that doesn't exist. Glorfindel is on the other side of the river. Frodo is on Asphalos, and he's gone across the river by himself. The Black Riders almost get to him. He is unable to resist their influence. And then the waves come. And then Glorfindel and all of the hobbits and Strider drive the rest of the riders into the water. We also see for the first time all of the riders. There's 9 of them. And they haven't appeared all together until now. They were split up all over the place looking for the hobbits, and specifically Frodo and the ring. And this is the first time that we get all of them together. And they all get pushed into the river and washed away. And Frodo passes out, and that's the end of Book 1. And let's hear it for Master Gamgee, yeah? Sam breaks out in a song about elves, which he learned from Bilbo, and then breaks out a song he wrote himself. Quite the little bard is Gamgee. And that was Book 1 of Lord of the Rings, the first half, more or less, of the Fellowship of the Ring. I don't know if you can tell or not, but I'm really enjoying, first of all, rereading this, but I'm also really enjoying doing vlogs like the kids do these days. I'm obviously not a kid anymore, but I've really enjoyed just sort of recording my thoughts as I go along. I hope it's actually entertaining for you too. As I mentioned in the relevant chapters, Tom Bombadil needs his own video. I'd be really interested what you think of Tom Bombadil. I have a very good friend, not naming any names. She said she has tried Lord of the Rings more than once and has DNF'd at the point of running into Tom Bombadil. I hope to remedy that, or at least make Tom Bombadil tolerable for people that hate him. So I will definitely do a deep dive character video just on Tom, but it might take a while. The next vlog will be coming out soon. I hope to have it out next week. It depends on how much reading I get done. Doing the reading with the recordings and then editing all of the recordings is actually pretty time consuming, and doing vlogs slows down my reading, but I'm enjoying it. So I'm going to keep doing it. Second video for the second half of Fellowship of the Ring will be out soon. December 9th is when I've scheduled to have the chat with Philip Chase and Mike from Mike's Book Reviews and AP Canavan from A Critical Dragon. The 4 of us will be discussing the whole Fellowship of the Ring. Spoilers for that, no spoilers for anything that comes after that. And I can't wait. There's a link in the description. There are also a number of links down there just to various other things I found. Tolkien can be a rabbit hole. If you read the expanded Legendarium, there is so much stuff. I found a really cool video, which is a professor explaining how to read Tolkien. And he's actually much more entertaining than you would expect a professor to be. There's a link for that down in the description, and a couple of other things, specifically some recordings that people have made of songs that are in Lord of the Rings, so that maybe you get a little bit of a feeling for it while you're reading, because just reading a song in text is not actually really a song, is it? So as usual, I hope you're well. I hope you're reading awesome Lord of the Rings chapters, and I will see you in the next vlog.